Well, I think everybody who's here this morning, and it's pretty obvious I'm not Jonathan. And somehow, for some reason, my telephone number was printed wrong, and he had trouble getting a hold of me, so he had to get a hold of the lovely Mrs. Bennett and finally find out where I am. And so he asked me if I could teach this lesson in his place. I said, okay, why not? So we're going to be starting here in Genesis 13. And before we start the lesson, I'd like to have a little prayer with the Lord, because you should always start a lesson with prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you've given us. We thank you for your word, which nourishes us and encourages us, enables us to live life as we should live. Please be with us as we study this lesson and if we go into your word, and may we be edified, and may we be made joyous with its reading. We pray all these things in the name of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, so now those of you who probably have read Genesis 13, you might come away thinking that it's some sordid family drama, two people clashing, relatives clashing over their possessions and land and things. So but it's more than that, really. And what I want to do is kind of try to elucidate the little deeper meanings into that clash. So first of all, let's read through. I'm going to read through Genesis chapter 13, and so we can kind of get an idea of the whole context of this incident. And I'm actually going to start with chapter 12 and the last verse of chapter 12, because that really kind of has a point in this whole narrative. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. And Abram went up to Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. Now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and gold, and he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been in the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first, and there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for the possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock, and at that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. And Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. And if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes, and he saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Adam settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot is separated from him, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring will also be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, which I will give to you." So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which were at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So, we know one thing from the previous chapter. Pharaoh pretty much kicked Abram out of Egypt for his, finagling with his, for his telling him that his wife was his sister. And Pharaoh was very angry, and he felt that his deception had brought tragedy upon the land of Egypt, and he kicked Lot out, Abram out, and Abram went back home. He went through the Negev desert, and he went back to where he had placed his altar before, as we saw in the previous chapter, that where he had put the altar of the Lord there between Bethel and Ai. He basically went home with his tail between his legs, basically. But it's not all bad for Abram, because if we read in verse 2, now Abram was very rich in livestock and in silver and in gold. So actually, Abram and Lot were actually very wealthy. Now, for the people of Abram and Lot's time, wealth was more than just silver and gold, because if you notice, the very first thing that they mentioned was his livestock. Because Abram and Lot were practicing what anthropologists would nowadays call a pastoral nomadic life. And basically, a pastoral nomadic life means that you have no set dwelling place. You basically move your tents and your possessions and all your livestock and all your people, all your family, all your servants, all your slaves, and you move them to a fresh location where you can find pasture and you can find water for your flocks and your herds. So both Abram and his nephew Lot were very rich. But at this time, there began to be some problem not between Abram and Lot themselves, but between his herdsmen. Now, to understand what the difficulty was, because if you notice, if you read the text, it doesn't say exactly what the conflict was about. It only said that the herdsmen of Abram and the herdsmen of Lot were having some sort of strife, some sort of conflict. But if you understand a little bit how the pastoral nomadic life works, then you begin to kind of understand why they might be in contention with each other. Well, first of all, as I said before, the tribes that live this type of lifestyle have to move frequently. And not only that, they have to move with according to the season. Because in this part of the Middle East, the winter rains would allow the nomads to move into the grassland plains to feed and water their livestock outside the normal settled zones where you had the cities. But when the summer dry season started, you would move back more towards the settled parts of the country where you'd be able to live more off of trade. And so that is why, basically, they lived in tents, because you had no one fixed place to go. You basically, everything you owned was in these tents. Everything you owned had to be able to be put on the back of beasts of burden, and you had to go from place to place. You had to go where the pasture was. You had to go where the water was. Now, the second thing that you have to keep in mind is that these type of nomadic tribes were not really under the rule of any sort of king. Now, they may have, you might say, like a nominal, allegiance to a king, but really the head of the tribe, such as Abram, or more or less in many ways like kings themselves. They were the rule of law for their tribes. Nobody had allegiance to anybody beyond the tribal leader, to the tribe and the tribal leader. So, and as a matter of fact, the kings of this time, now if you remember the kings of this time, they're ruling more, they don't rule large countries the way we know it. I mean, you have the United States, and everybody has their allegiance to the government of the United States, and it's covered in a big area. But if somebody has coverage, rules a large area, it's usually because you're king and you've conquered all this land, and you've conquered a bunch of smaller city states, and then you extract tribute from them, and you're more or less control of that, but you really don't worry about the parts that are just rural areas, or where you have your nomadic tribes, because as far as you're concerned, you're not important. As long as you're ruling the cities and you're able to get tribute and goods from them, you're pretty satisfied. So in a way, the nomadic tribes were separate nation states, and their leaders were more or less almost sovereign sovereign kings in a way. They even had treaties, would form treaties with the various kings in the neighborhood or various rulers in the neighborhood over terms of watering rights and things like that. Sometimes they would even have in treaties for trade between, of course, because you grew this livestock. Well, you can't eat goat and sheep every day. You'd probably get sick of it. So you're willing to trade some of this for things that you can't make yourself. So because remember, they have no agriculture, they have no wheat, have no amer, they don't have any barley, they don't have some of the stuff that they might want for their to alleviate the boredom of having nothing but meat for dinner. So so in a way, they were like little kingdoms, little fiefdoms in themselves. Now the third thing to remember is that in some sense, that everybody who was a member of the tribe was part of the family. The leader was responsible for them. You had, of course, your own family. You had your extended family who would often be with you, cousins and such like. You would have servants and slaves, and you would have the herdsmen. The herdsmen were the ones who took care shepherds and people who took care of the various flocks that they had and herds that they had. And these were generally young men who were, trained in this, and they were actually the strength of the tribe. They were the ones who did most of the hard work. They were the ones who were the ones who took care of the various flocks. In a matter of fact, they were the ones who, in effect, protected the wealth, because the main part of the wealth of the tribe, of these nomadic tribes, was their animals, their livestock. Because if you don't have that, you don't have anything. What's the point of sitting out in a tent if you don't have any, you might as well just go live in the cities. So the fourth thing is that in these tribes, you do not have like a separate military. You don't have you don't have an army, you don't have your own military forces to protect you and to protect the herds. That's what the herdsmen were for. So it's quite possible that they were very well trained in military matters. At least they were trained as fighting men. Because if you recall, when the kings of the valley seize Lot and all his possessions, it was Abram's men. In fact, he had it mentioned in Genesis 14:14 that he had 318 trained men of his household who rescued Lot and his women and everybody in his tribe and all his possessions from the kings of the Jordan Valley. So if with this knowledge, if we look at the conflict, it becomes pretty obvious that the strife between Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen probably had to do with the fact that there was only so much land and only so much water to go between them. They had too many. When it said the Bible said they had too many possessions, of course they had too many animals to feed and water, and there was not enough resources in this whole area to be able to support the both of them. So now, if you remember when I said that the loyalty of these herdsmen only go up to their tribal leaders, to their tribe and to the tribal leaders. So naturally, the herdsmen for Lot are going to contend with the herdsmen for Abram, and they're fighting over these scarce resources. And this is where the source of the conflict obviously is coming from. And if you look also in chapter 7, if we get to the whole context of chapter 7, there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. So it's obvious that the people who were already civilized that part of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, were also putting some sort of pressure on the resources there, because they had their own uses for the land, because they had, of course, were growing crops, and they had to, especially in this area, they had to have water, be able to water their crops, so they had to have irrigation complexes set up. I was putting extra pressure between and causing extra strife between Abram's people and Lot's people. So how does Abram handle this delicate situation? Because he really had no quarrel with Lot. He loved his nephew. He didn't want to fight with him. He didn't want to see his people fight with his people. So in verse 8 and 9, Abram says, "Let there be no strife between you and me, between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is it not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." So this is an interesting situation because really Abram is the patriarch. He's the oldest, and he's the one with the most authority and the most prestige. Yet he's giving a choice to Lot. He's able him to pick what he wants to pick, and which is very generous, and which I'll get into later. So Lot's taking a look at the valley of Jordan, which to him is beautiful as the Garden of Eden, and he chooses to go eastward and dwell there near the city of Sodom. And Abram had to content himself with the land of Canaan. And at this point, the Bible reminds us in verse 13 that the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Well, we don't need to dwell on that, but we do know it's true because God had to destroy them later on in the narrative. So Lot says, well, he takes all his tents, and he takes all his possessions, and he takes all his people, and he takes all his herdsmen, and he decides he's going to dwell in the valley of Jordan next to the city of Sodom. And because if you notice by the time that in the next chapter when Lot is taken by the kings of the valley, Lot is actually living in the city. He's giving up the pastoral nomadic life, and he's living in the city. He's given up his tents. He's living in one of the dwellings there. And so might be tempted to think that Abram really got the short end of the stick of that deal because, Lot did take the more desirable and more fertile valley of Jordan. But God had reiterates his promise to him in verse 14. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift your eyes up and look at the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring will also be counted. Arise and walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So Abram is trusting in the promises of God, because it doesn't matter which part he takes or which part Abram takes. He knows that he has God's promise that God is going to give him that entire land for him and his offspring forever. And he believed in God's promise. So to him, well, it didn't matter so much. So he decided to take his tent, and he took his family and all his possessions and all his people, and he moved to the Oaks of Mamre in Hebron, and there he built an altar to God. So let us, shall we say, compare and contrast. That's always fun to do. Well, first of all, Abram took the initiative to peace. As you remember in Matthew 5:9, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they should be called sons of God." So Abram knew that it wasn't his fault that his herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen had clashed together. But he knew he had to do something to act in order to maintain the peace between him and his kinsmen. He said, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen." Now, you got to remember that these young men had military training. So if there had been a clash, well, there certainly would have been peace because it would have gotten, they had enough, in fact, Abram's people had enough military potential to fight with the kings of the valley and be able to rescue Lot. So it would have been, as a matter of fact, been very dangerous if they were confined in this cramped little space and they had fought each other. They would have had a fight that neither one of them really wanted or really intended. And sometimes it comes that way because sometimes, we have all the goodwill in the world, and the people around us, the people who are part of our family or our friends, they get into strife and they get into quarrels and that we don't want and we have no part of. But somehow we've got to do something to make it right. Somehow we've got to make it peaceful. I mean, haven't you all seen, family arguments? And I know my family has been, had a few. And you don't want to have any part of it, but you don't want to have that happen. So you have to do something. Abram did what he could. He swallowed his pride and said, even though I could have, asserted my prerogatives as the elder, the patriarch of this entire family, he didn't do that. He allowed Lot to have his pick because he wanted to have peace between them. And he felt that that was not too high a price to have peace between his family and Lot's family, between, Lot's people and his people. It's sort of like that old saying that you've heard that it's not my fault, but it is my problem. When your family and your friends quarrel, it's not necessarily your fault, but it is your problem. The second thing, Abram was very generous because we do know that God had promised that entire land in Genesis 12, to your offspring I give this land. So God promised the entire land of Canaan to Abram and his descendants, as far as you could see from the north and to the south and to the east and to the west, that was given in to him. And he did have the right as the patriarch of the family to be able to dispose of this land as he saw fit, be able to parcel out to whoever he saw fit. But for the sake of peace and for the love of his nephew, Abram allowed Lot to take his pick of the land because Abram had full faith that God would fulfill his promises to him. And I think it's out of that generosity, which, comes from a generous spirit, you might say, comes from the fact that God is generous to us. God has blessed us fully. And how can we be selfish if God has been so generous and so good to us? The interesting thing, the third item I want to point out, Lot was covetous. I always had trouble saying that word. Lot was covetous. He gazed upon this beautiful, fertile valley, and he said, boy, I really want that. I want that valley because it's so beautiful and it's so fertile and so beautiful. And I want to take my herds there, and I want to settle there, and I will grow and prosper even more than I am now. And he had no problem giving Abram the tail end of that deal. But appearances can be deceiving. The land of Sodom was beautiful and fertile, but spiritually it was ugly and barren. We're in verse 8, verse 13, where he says, the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. If you go to earlier in the book of Genesis, when we were talking about the way that the men of the earth were in the time of Noah, the same word that's translated here as wicked is the same word. So the people of Sodom were every bit as just as bad as the people of the earth before God decided to destroy the land with a flood. And we need not go yet into the exact nature of the wickedness or what they do there, because the class will get there soon enough. but Sodom had become a byword for evil and wickedness at the time that the book of Genesis and the rest of the Torah had been compiled. And even in Jesus' time, Jesus compared the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes unfavorably with the men of Sodom, and compared his present generation with the wickedness of Sodom. So appearances can be deceiving. What we could see as being fair and beautiful and lush and wonderful is actually underneath rotten and filled with filth. So we have to discern with true discernment, not based merely on appearances alone. So as we know, that Lot later on in the story gets in trouble living in the city of Sodom. He gets captured by the kings of the valley, and he has to be rescued by Abram. But of course, later in the narrative, living in the city, the angels of the Lord come to visit him, and he has to flee with his wife and all his people from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which God had decided to destroy. So he had deceived himself by looking only upon the appearance of the valley, but he didn't really take a good hard look at the people living there, because bad associates corrupt good morals. If you hang out with people or associate with people who seem fair to everybody else, but you know that they are not good people inside, you might think, well, that doesn't affect me because I'm going to prosper with the association of this people, the association with this place, and I'm going to, make money, and I'm going to become a richer and a more prosperous person. And you work for a company which you make money, but it's actually they make shoddy products, or they or to do bad things. They're horrible polluters, or they're fraudulent. Well, what is the worth to gain the world if you lose your soul? And that's what's happening with Lot. He did not take into account the wickedness of the people of Sodom, because this is something you could have found out. In fact, it's something you should have found out. No, all he was really interested in was taking his herds, taking his family, taking his tents, and moving over to this area where Sodom was, and making himself richer with the fertile valley that he saw. So I think that's the biggest lesson we should learn of all from this chapter, is that appearances can be deceiving, and that we should be very careful about who we associate and which choices that we make. Because even though you don't really intend any evil, if you are in the wrong place with the wrong people, that could be inherently corrupting, and you might end up being in a situation that you don't want to be. So anyway, I think that's all we have for today, and I want to thank you for your attention. Do you have any questions? Then that's a very good point, because Myrna was saying that it would have been, if they had actually gone into actual physical conflict, that would have shown their weakness, and that would have been considered by maybe like a larger tribe or some other city that wanted to gobble them up, that they were right picking, for conflict. And which is true, because why waste your military you might have a powerful military position with all your herdsmen who are trained in fighting, but you are inevitably going to weaken yourself by having a useless conflict amongst yourselves, because you're going to be stronger, more united. Because if you have your family if you get into a fight that's going to be more than the military potential of your your tribe is going to have, well, you get the herdsmen of your various family and allied tribes to help you into the fight. And if you waste it on useless fighting, um, or strife, you've really wasted your own military potential. Anybody have any questions or comments? Yeah. Yes, exactly. Oh, that's true. And not only that, consider the fact that for all practical purposes, Lot is a king, a sovereign king over his little nation. And if you're a leader, the important thing to remember about being a leader is your actions mean something, because people look to the leader to see how they act and how, what their moral code should be. If How long would this church last if we had evil and corrupt elders, which we obviously do not have? And how long would the church last? You've seen all the scandals in so-called non-denominational churches where basically they don't have a plurality of eldership as required by the New Testament. They have one man, or one man and wife team who rule the whole thing, and they're corrupt. They steal money from their congregants and spend it on themselves, or even find some legitimate way of spending it on themselves. And of course, then that starts degenerating into sexual license and abuse. And we've seen that, and it brings great shame to the name of Christianity and to God. That's why having wise and prudent leaders is very important, because Lot failed in foresight and seeing only the surface for the moment, and he failed to see what was beneath that surface. What kind of culture was he bringing himself and his family and his people to? And he abandoned the ways of his father eventually and became part of the city, and he lived in the city. And although he did not share in its corrupt nature, it was pretty obvious that probably all that had followed him in his tribe had fallen away and gone their own ways, and probably became part of the city and the culture. So that's a very important part is that, when you're a leader, you're not free to think of yourself or think of what you're doing. It's just not for yourself. It's you have to think about, and it's the same thing for those who teach, is, more judgment will be placed on the teachers if they fail than it will be for just the rest of us. Because you're a leader and you're influencing people, and what you say and what you do matters. So because your character counts just as much as for what exactly policies you do have, because people are looking at you, and they're looking at what you're doing and what you're saying. And there's nothing more disheartening to a church or a nation to see hypocrisy and seeing bad character. And anybody else have anything to say? Oh, I think you're good. All right. Well, let's not as long as I thought it'd be, but but I think we're done here. Thank you.